So last week when I began my sermon, I told you that I thought it was a really, really good sermon. And do you know why I thought it was a really good sermon? It's because I thought it was particularly good because it spoke to me, because it spoke to my needs. I don't know whether it was a good sermon for you, but it was a good sermon for me. And guess what? This morning I got a perfect sermon. When I was preparing for this particular Sunday, and I have been preparing actually for weeks, I had a vision of being able to present to you kind of a systematic, paradigmatic approach to the concept of reconciliation that would help you perceive and fit into place what we're trying to do through this reconciliation process that we're about to undergo. And as I made my notes and as I pondered and as I prayed and as I read, and I have read a lot, I thought I sort of had it under control and I thought I had a perspective, but then I began to write, and I wrote, and I chewed away on it because that's what I do. I kind of write myself empty and then review what I've written, and I try to bring it into a manageable slice. And as I began to read the final, what I thought was the final draft, it just became evident to me that what God had given to me for you was not what I thought it was going to be at all. It was something that desperately I needed, something that I needed to apply in my life, and therefore I believe it's something that we all need to apply in all of our lives. So I begin this morning with some trepidation. It's been a tough week, and part of this sermon I've written through my tears. But at the same time, there's been such a peace, and there is such a joy, and it is such a gift to be able to sit and ponder God's word and ponder how it may relate to myself and of course, us as a family here at Queensway. This is the second sermon of our new series, which we are calling The Way. And you'll recall through this slide that this series kind of speaks to 7 church disciplines or practices that we believe define a well-functioning New Testament church. And we're looking at each of these 7 disciplines through 3 separate lenses, as subjects, as hosts, and as guests. Last week, I talked to you about the Lord's table and that God's faithful presence was to be found there in a particularly special way, in a way that we call God's manifest presence. And essentially, I made 3 points, and I'll review those with you really quickly. God's faithful presence means the reality that God is present in the world and that he uses a people faithful to his presence to make himself concrete and real amid the world's struggles and pains. Number 2, it means that we do not welcome God into our presence, but rather God welcomes us into his. And finally, faithful presence must be a communal reality before it can affect the world. It must take shape as a complete way of life in a particular people. That's where I went last Sunday. This morning, I want to move on to the second of our 7 disciplines observed from the perspective of Christ's followers as subjects, members of a close circle, a close community. Another way of describing what we are saying is that wherever these 7 disciplines are faithfully practiced, the presence of God will be active and evident. So I'm going to talk to you this morning about reconciliation. And there's the Lloydism underneath. Reconciliation, not an option, but a command of the King. Not an option, but a command of the King. So thus it follows that if God is present in a group of his followers, the second discipline of reconciliation will be practiced, and it should be obvious that one cannot speak about reconciliation from a Christian perspective without speaking about forgiveness. They coexist together. The two topics are conjointly related. They go hand in hand, yet they are different. Forgiveness is an internal process where you work through the heart, you gain an understanding of what has happened, you rebuild a sense of safety and let go of the grudge. The offending party can be, but is not necessarily a part of the process. Sometimes you just forgive on your own. Forgiveness involves setting oneself free from the effects of perceived injury. Psychologist and Professor Lewis Smedes said this: "To forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you." Now, reconciliation is an interpersonal process where one dialogues about what happened, exchange stories, express the hurt, listen for remorse, and begin to establish trust. And it's a much more complicated process and a process that includes but moves beyond forgiveness. Forgiveness is solo. Reconciliation's a joint venture. Here's the Lloydism. It takes one person to forgive, but it takes 2 or more people to be reconciled. I preached my first sermon here about 1 month shy of a year ago, on November the 15th, 2020. And do you remember what the title of that sermon was? What? Come on now, this is a test. Well, it was called "Who Will Build a Bridge?" On that day, if you'll recall, I told the story about 2 farmer brothers who were in dispute, and one of them hired a carpenter to build a fence along a river that separated their 2 properties. You remember that story? Yeah. The farmer bought the material for the fence, gave the carpenter his instructions, and left for the day. When he got home, he discovered that the carpenter had not built a fence at all, but had built a bridge over the river. And what he found was his brother walking over the bridge, arms outstretched, seeking forgiveness. So inspired was he by the other brother's gesture of what? Forgiveness and reconciliation. Now here we are. Here we are again, almost a year later, beginning our own exercise in bridge building. Thank God. Thank God that we have a master carpenter, Jesus, to guide us. So this sermon comes out of a wealth of previous reading, as I said, with perspectives and examples and advice way too vast to kind of adequately reference for you. But I did want to mention some of the reading that I've done, because although the thoughts for the sermon originate with me, they come to me by way of a list of authors to whom I am really very deeply indebted. So to name just a few, in my sermon this morning, I'm referencing Timothy Keller, I'm referencing Peter Scazzero, Miroslav Volf, Karl Barth, Jürgen Moltmann, Leanne Payne, D.A. Carson, and I'm also referencing Father Henry Nouwen. I begin, therefore, with a discussion of what it means to forgive as a precursor to my thoughts about reconciliation. And that's going to take a fair bit of time. Because obviously, I think we can all agree that forgiveness is an integral component of the Christian faith as it relates to reconciliation. My hope is for a more practical kind of reflection on this subject. What do forgiveness and reconciliation look like as they are worked out in the life of the individual Christ follower and the community that seeks to follow the way of Christ? What does it look like? One of my favorite sayings is, what does that look like with pants on? And that's what I mean. Practically, what does it look like? But for those perhaps not having arrived at the point where they are actually considering themselves follower of Christ yet, I offer you a glimpse of what life in Christ can and should be, and that it is often not yet a reality, but that only reflects the degree of brokenness within and outside of the church. But at least we have the power to change. In a recovery ministry called Celebrate Recovery, one of the things that is said there is that we as a recovering body of individuals name our higher power. And we name that power to be Jesus Christ. The culture does not name their higher power in that sense, because they cannot. Dr. Timothy Keller said this: on both a theological and a practical level, forgiveness is at the very heart of what it means to be a Christian. True forgiveness comes at a cost and is pursued intentionally within a community of believers. Unquote. The church, the human community that the Bible requires, should cut across all cultures and individual temperaments. Put another way, it doesn't fit any culture, but challenges them all at some point. Christians from more individualistic cultures, for example, love the Bible's emphasis on affirming one another and sharing hurts and problems, but they hate the idea of accountability and discipline. Christians from more traditional communal cultures love the emphasis on accountability for morals and beliefs, but often chafe at an emphasis on racial reconciliation and being open about one's personal hurts and financial needs. But one could argue that the biblical teaching on forgiveness and reconciliation is so radical that there are no cultures or no societies and no real church perspectives that are in accord with it. It goes beyond our metaphors, it goes beyond our imaginations. It may be here, most of all, that we see the truth of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's statement. Our community with one another in Christ consists solely in what Christ has done to both of us. Christian brotherhood is a spiritual and not a human reality. In this it differs from all other communities. Profound statement. In its most basic and simple form, this teaching is that Christians in community are to never give up on one another, never give up on relationship, and never write off another believer. My goodness, where would I be today with all of my baggage and all of my stuff in my youth if people had written me off? But they did not. They prayed for me. They comforted me. And they knocked me up the side of the head sometimes when I needed it. We must never tire of forgiving and repenting and seeking to repair our relationships. In Matthew 18, Peter asked, "How many times must I forgive?" And Jesus said 70 times 70, which essentially means never stop. Never stop forgiving. In the preceding verses of that same chapter, verses 15 to 20, Jesus says that we should approach someone as if we have nothing against them. In short, if any relationship is cooled off or is weakened in any way, it is always our move. It doesn't matter who started it. God always holds us responsible to reach out to repair a tattered relationship. And that's not great news, is it? I get that. Oh, I get that. I have a lot of pride. I got a lot of issues. I got a lot of hurt. I got a lot of people to blame. But don't shoot me. Don't shoot the messenger. I actually have as much trouble with the statement as you may have. Because it somehow seems unfair. Yet, it is there. It is there in unmistakable and inescapable terms. The Christian is responsible to begin the process of reconciliation, regardless of how the distance or the alienation began, and it begins with a journey of forgiveness. And what is that? What is forgiveness? What does it look like? When speaking of forgiveness, Jesus uses the image of debts to describe the nature of sins. Look at Matthew 6, verse 12. Matthew 18, verses 21 to 35. So when someone seriously wrongs you, there is an absolutely unavoidable sense that the wrongdoer owes you something. The wrong has incurred an obligation. It's a liability, a debt. Anyone who has been wronged feels a compulsion to make the other person pay down the debt. It's justice. We do that by hurting them. By yelling at them, by making them feel bad in some way, or just passively waiting and watching and hoping that something bad happens to them. And that, by the way, that's the classic definition of passive aggression. And only after we see them suffer in some commensurate ways do we sense that the debt has been paid and the required obligation is gone. How dare we? Forgiveness means giving up the right to seek repayment from the one who harmed you. And it must be recognized for what it is. It makes you suffer. Forgiveness is a form of voluntary suffering. Like think about how monetary debts work. So if I have a friend and he breaks my lamp, for example, and if the lamp costs $50 to replace, then the act of lamp breaking incurs a debt of $50, right? So if I let him pay for and replace the lamp, I get my lamp back and he's out $50. But if I forgive him for what he did, the debt does not somehow vanish into thin air. When I forgive him, I absorb the cost and the payment for the lamp. Neither I will pay the $50 again to replace it, or I'm going to lose lighting in the room. Either way, it's going to cost me something. So to forgive is to cancel a debt by paying it or absorbing it yourself. Because somebody always pays every debt. In all cases, when wrong is done, there is a debt, and there is no way to deal with it without suffering. Either we make the perpetrator suffer, or we forgive and suffer it ourselves. Forgiveness is always extremely costly. When you forgive, you can pay that debt yourself in several ways. And I want to look at those ways. Number one, first, you refuse vengeance. You refuse payback or the infliction of pain. Instead, you try to be as cordial as possible. You must beware of subtle ways to try to exact payment while assuring yourself that you aren't. So that means that you do not make cutting remarks and drag out past injuries repeatedly over and over again. It means that you won't be far more demanding and controlling with this particular person than you are with others, all because you feel deep down that they still owe you. It means that you do not punish them with self-righteous mercy that is really a way to make them feel small and to justify yourself. You avoid being cold toward them. I know all this, because I've done all this. Number two, well, that's pretty self-explanatory. You don't run them down under the guise of warning people about them or under the guise of seeking sympathy and support for sharing your hurt. Try to protect their integrity as well as yours. Number three, don't engage in ill will in your heart. Don't keep playing the tape over and over again. Don't demonize the other person or persons in your imagination. Rather, recognize the common sinful humanity you share with him or with her. Don't root for them to fail. Don't hope for their pain. I know that too. This is terribly difficult stuff, and frankly, no one who has been deeply wronged just forgives. If someone wrongs you, there are only two options. One, you make them suffer, or two, you refuse revenge and forgive them, and then you suffer. But think about this. If we can't forgive without suffering, how much more must God suffer in order to forgive us because we refuse to suffer? Because someone always has to suffer. On the cross, we see God forgiving us. And that was possible only if God suffered. On the cross, God's love satisfied his own justice by suffering, by bearing the penalty for sin, our sin, not his sin. There is never forgiveness without suffering. Nails, thorns, sweat, blood, tears, anguish. Never. There's a world of deep and fruitful teaching on this subject, but I haven't got time. We've got to move along. But consider this quote from the hand of noted Swiss theologian Karl Barth. The root and origin of sin is the arrogance in which man wants to be his own and his neighbor's judge. We can remain bitter towards someone only if we feel superior. If we are sure that we would never do anything like that. Gosh, that was brought home to me in spades as I sat and watched the movie Schindler's List for the first time. Ralph Fiennes played the role of the German commandant in that movie, bringing unfortunate people in vast numbers to their death. He played that role so well and so humanly. And I began to understand him. And I began to understand his motivation. And then I woke up and I thought, what is this? If I can understand it, I could be that man. I could be capable of that kind of atrocity. To remain unforgiving means that we're unaware of our own sinfulness and need for forgiveness. At the same time, we can't be gracious to someone if we are too needy and insecure, if we know if we know God's love and forgiveness, then there is a limit to how deeply someone can hurt us. If we know in our hearts, if it's so deeply ingrained that God loves us, he or she can't touch our real identity, our real worth and significance. The more we rejoice in our own forgiveness, the quicker we will be able to forgive others. We become emotionally rooted in God's valuation of us. The commands are clear. We have to forgive. We have to reconcile. We read one of those commands this morning. And the teaching of Paul is clear as well. Don't come to the Lord's table without reconciling with a brother or sister with whom you have a problem. Couldn't be clearer. The scales of God's justice demand a payment, a reckoning for the sins that we commit against one another. And this is true both inside and outside of the church, but it's especially required by those followers who have formed this close circle of worshiping and serving together, of coming together around the table. Now, of course, there are situations and there are circumstances that develop within a congregation that require a just and an open method of confrontation. There's nothing wrong with confrontation. Confrontation is clarifying. That's alliteration. Both Paul and Jesus gave us a blueprint for how that needs to be done in the fellowship of God's people. I'm not going to go into that a whole lot, but what is really of utmost importance when we consider that teaching is the issue of motivation, issue of motivation of what brings us together. The Bible calls us to deeply forgive on the inside so as to have no desire for vengeance, but then we are to speak openly about what has happened with a desire to help clarify what the issues are, what the impact was. In reality, inner forgiveness and outward correction kind of work together. But listen to this. Only if we have forgiven inside can we correct unabusively without trying to make the person feel terrible. That's a Lloydism. Paul's sage advice to the Corinthian church rings with truth for all of us. Found in Colossians chapter 3, verses 12, and that should say 12 to 15. Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against you, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you. So you must also forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you are called in one body, and be thankful. And to remind us of why we are having this conversation, this condition of the heart, so eloquently expressed by Paul, is also the heart of reconciliation. I want you also to consider Paul's words to a different church at a different time, found in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. Rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, that is, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, make the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. So as we speak the truth in love, another admonishment by Paul, we are to pursue justice gently and humbly in order to redress the wrongs, and yet maintain or restore the relationship. And you know what? There's a great deal of tension that exists between these three things that he talks about: gentleness, humility, and reconciliation. They don't just sort of flow together easily. Almost always, one of the things like one of gentleness or one of humility is more easily attained if we simply drop any concern for the other two. For example, it's easy to speak the truth if one has given up any desire to maintain a warm relationship. Eh? Perhaps it is possible to convince oneself that we have forgiven someone, but if afterward we still want nothing to do with them and don't pursue an ongoing relationship, that's reconciliation, then that is a sign that you actually spoke the truth without forgiving. Now we've reached the point where I need to really clarify something here. There are instances in some of our lives where we have experienced serious harm and very painful damage at the hands of specific individuals. That is a reality. That, frankly, is my reality. And I'm referencing extremely abusive situations of various kinds when I say that. And I want you to know that there is absolutely no requirement for anyone to place themselves into a situation that would be emotionally triggering or unsafe. That is not the case. And that's not what we're talking about here. Forgiveness may still be operative in these instances for one's own emotional welfare, and that is so true. But reconciliation, face-to-face reconciliation, may just not be possible. Paul tells us, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Romans 12:18. And some translations interpret "as it depends on you" to mean as long as it is possible. And sometimes it is just not possible. So don't knock yourself out. There are ways, there are methods. Let me just pause here. And if there's someone here in this room, in our congregation, or out there who are hearing these words, and you are struggling with something really, really deep in terms of forgiveness, then I'd love to help. I have resources. I know about things and places that can be of help to you, because I've been down that road. So just pick up the phone. I think there's enough places where you can find my number and my email. Well, I'm on this track. Let me also take a moment to address the issue of codependency. You know, a love that says, I'll do anything to keep him or her loving and approving of me, is not real love at all. It's not loving the person. It is loving the love that you get from the person. True love is willing to confront, even to lose the beloved in the short run, if there's a chance to help them, if there's a chance to clarify for them what their actions are doing to those around them. But this morning I'm focusing on these kinds of issues that affect what happens in our family, in the church. Because they exist and they need to be confronted for what they are. So this sermon is partly about relationships at Queensway Baptist Church. And it's about our desire to move forward in a loving, integrated, spiritually healthy congregation of Christ followers. That's what we're trying to do here. And we have work to do. And we cannot do it alone. Forgiveness and reconciliation are such a huge part of our progress because it affects our emotional health as individuals and as a congregation. And Peter Scazzaro, in his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, which is a phenomenal book, by the way, tells us that it is impossible to be spiritually healthy if we are not emotionally healthy. If we find that any wrongdoing immediately cools us to another, and we want to insist on our right to an apology, perhaps we need to do some self-examination regarding the level of our emotional humility. Love should cover a multitude of sins. That means most of them. So what are the marks of an unreconciled relationship? An unreconciled relationship is marked by avoidance, coldness, and irritability. So if we find ourselves avoiding being cold toward or being irritated with someone, or if we can tell that someone is cold or irritable towards us or is avoiding us, then we probably have an unreconciled relationship. Got that out. If it walks like a duck and it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck. On the other hand, I forgive you does not mean I trust you. Some people think they haven't reconciled until they can completely trust the person who has done wrong or has grieved them in some way. In reality, it's not the case. Forgiveness means a willingness to try to reestablish trust, but that reestablishment is always a process, and that process is called reconciliation. It's what we're about. This process of reconciliation begins with communication. Obviously, we have to talk to one another. Ignoring the hurt and the pain caused by the perceived actions of others translates into unresolved issues that gather their own negative energy, which, when buried and compressed, usually erupt with the most unpleasant consequences. And again, I speak to you from personal experiences. But I also tell you that it has happened here at Queensway Baptist Church. But you're not alone. It happens everywhere that humans, not yet perfected in their journey with Christ, congregate. And that would be all of us. What it means is that discord and differences will always be with us, this side of heaven. You know, it even happened with Paul and Barnabas. And they eventually were forced to sever their partnership in ministry and go their separate ways. You can read all about it in Acts chapter 3. Yeah, communication is absolutely necessary. And that is why we are designating the first 2 Wednesdays of our all-church gatherings to this process of kind of formal reconciliation, this process of listening to one another. We'll gather to speak and hear each other's truths in love and in respect. We will recognize that each person in our congregations brings in them unique gifts that are required by this family. And sometimes that particular gift is sheer and simple neediness. Henry Nouwen discovered this when called out of academia to spend his days caring for Adam, a paraplegic who couldn't function in any way and couldn't even speak. Nouwen spent 10 years looking after him. In his remarkable book, Adam, God's Beloved, Henry describes how through Adam he came to a new and a deeper understanding of his faith and what it means to be beloved of God. Nouwen emphasized that even though he had risen to the heights of academia, becoming a respected and popular lecturer at 3 Ivy League universities, as well as a prolific author, his experience as a servant to the needs of the helpless residents of the L'Arche community in Richmond Hill, Ontario, taught him so much more about his own brokenness and his own need for healing found in a community of faith. That's what we're building here at Queensway Baptist Church, a community of faith. And it begins with the ministry of reconciliation. That is always where it begins, because that is ultimately what God is about. What he has always been about. Paul makes that so evident in these verses found in 2 Corinthians 5:17-21. And I just love how Eugene Peterson paraphrases it in the Message. Let me read it to you. Beginning at verse 15, he included everyone in his death so that everyone could also be included in his life. A resurrection life, a far better life than people ever lived on their own. Because of this decision, we don't evaluate people by what they have or how they look. We looked at the Messiah that way once, and we got it all wrong, as you know. We certainly don't look at him that way anymore. Now we look inside, and what we see is that anyone united with the Messiah gets a fresh start, a created new. The old life is gone, a new life burgeons. Look at it. All this comes from the God who settled the relationship between us and him, reconciled it, and then called us to settle our relationships with each other, reconcile them. God put the world square with himself through the Messiah, giving the world a fresh start by offering forgiveness of sins. God has given us the task of telling everyone what he is doing. We're Christ's representatives. God uses us to persuade men and women to drop their differences and enter into God's work of making things right between them, reconciling. We're speaking for Christ himself now. My goodness. Become friends with God. He's already a friend with you. How, you say? In Christ, God put the wrong on him who never did anything wrong so that we could be right with God. So we embark on our long-awaited journey of reconciliation and rebuilding of our community. And as we do that, let's keep these things in mind. The ultimate bridge builder is Jesus Christ himself. But we are his body, sometimes broken just as he was on a cross, the very meaning of which just screamed reconciliation. So I'll just end with this last quotation. And this time I offer you the words of Henry Nouwen, who writes of community. He writes this. However, community is first of all a quality of the heart. It grows from the spiritual knowledge that we are alive not for ourselves, but for one another. Community is the fruit of our capacity to make the interests of others more important than our own. The question, therefore, is not, how can we make community? But how can we develop and nurture giving hearts?